Okay, and do you want me to hit, is there any other settings I should hit?
No, that's
No.
it. As long as it's
Okay.
recording. So, hey, good morning. This is June Griffin. Dr. Judy Griffin, as my mother likes to say. And this is a new episode of my podcast. I know it's been a while, and yeah, I might explain that at some point, but we're not going to do that right now. I'm here with Nancy Smith, and I'm going to let her introduce herself and tell us a little bit about herself.
Hi, yeah, welcome to podcast listeners. My name is Nancy Smith with a Y, Smyth, just to be difficult, and I am on the faculty of the University at Buffalo, where I was the dean for about 17 years and stepped back to faculty, um, and mostly am doing work in faculty development. My own research initially was in trauma and addiction, and but there's nothing like being dean for 17 years to disconnect you from your research. So at this point, I've been focusing more on technology and social work, and I'm actually doing some work in public health related to long COVID. And mostly I'm doing some national leadership stuff with the Network for Social Work Management and grand challenges, futures thinking, and thinking about social work tech. So I did have a private practice for a bunch of years, and I had to shut it down after I was in the dean's job about 5 years. So again, working with folks with trauma and addiction, EMDR, some of those things, and yeah, I think that's probably enough. So
That's a lot, and that's pretty impressive. It's a really cool background.
thanks. Yeah,
So,
it's
when one of the reasons that we are here is because we are similarly obsessed with technology. We're interested in technology and social work, right?
yeah.
So, what do you feel are some of the best uses of technology and social work, or how do you feel it? Yeah, because that's a different question. So, what do you feel are some of the best uses of technology and social work?
Well, I think of them as sort of two categories. One is understanding what technology means to the people you're working with. In other words, if you're doing work with clients,
Hmm.
and that's actually what's always pulled me into tech further was I had clients many years ago who were in Second Life, and I felt like I couldn't understand, what some of that meant to them and what they were doing in that space without understanding it myself. So I didn't go in and friend them there, but I went into Second Life and started to try to explore it and understand it, to be culturally literate, really, was what it was.
Hmm.
And similarly, clients blogging led me into blogging and, all of those things. So I think it's too often we sort of think of tech as a side piece, and understanding people's relationship to tech and how they're using it in their lives is part of who they are. So um, I think that's a skill, and it is a skill, particularly across the lifespan, because there's also ways tech that can help people, and there may be ways they're getting into trouble with tech, right?
Hmm.
Need some help sort of thinking that through. And if you don't understand it, you're going to be unable to sort of help that way. And then
Hmm.
I think for now, tech is wow, it's rapidly evolving. I think there's so much at this point that people could use tech to actually help them do better work in what they're doing, as long as they're doing it carefully and um, not sharing data that's private. Um, but you can actually develop homework assignments. You can develop the tools. I used to use a lot of measurement with my clients. I mean, we actually would. This is in the there really weren't a lot of good tech tools, but I had people filling out numbers of panic attacks they were experiencing, and I would do screening tools like for dissociation and depression. We would track that stuff over time, and it was a pain in the butt because people would come in with the instruments filled out, and we'd have to sort of do it together. And I would
Hmm.
have clients who would actually take their graphs from our work together to back home to put on their walls because they really liked that. And these days, there's tons that you could do to help people sort of do those things again, but it's got to be done carefully so you're not sending data off to the data lords. And
Right. So you were essentially doing measurement-based care.
I was, and I tell you, it really made me make better decisions clinically. I would have missed, in some cases, I would have missed dissociation I didn't pick up. I would have missed, in some cases, EMDR wasn't working for somebody, and I wouldn't have seen that. probably for months until, except that I could see the dissociation scores actually went up after we did trauma work, which is not supposed to, right? So
Mhm.
it made me back off. That sort of database decision making that we would do together. It was not just me doing it for them. We would do it together and would see progress. And part of that was also hearing from them what would progress mean to them, and in some cases that I was um, missing things that I hadn't. In fact, I remember one of my very early being horrified after I gave the Beck depression inventory to one of my clients in an addiction clinic and saw how severe it was. And
Mhm.
I was very upset that I hadn't given it to her sooner,
Mhm.
because this was clearly somebody who had grown up in a family where her needs were not being met. So she didn't know what normal was. So
Mhm.
she's been, and then when I saw these scores as high as they were, I knew she needed probably to be on medication in addition to the therapy. And I never would
Right.
have. And so it is really, for me, it was part of doing really effective care. And I think technology provides us with some of those tools now to do some of that,
Mhm.
including some neurofeedback tools, that people can use. At the time, I was using heart math and some things like that. So I really think that helping people use that in their own lives, not just in treatment, because I think I always said we should have been born with owner's manuals, and we weren't. So actually, as part of my treatment, would have people create their own owner's manual for themselves, like,
Mhm.
to understand. And some of that is understanding how often something's happening or what's going on and how do I know something's a problem and those sorts of things. So those are conversations we would have together. I'm a recovering cognitive behavior therapist. I was trained initially, and I don't consider that my primary way of thinking about things anymore. But I do think applying those tools in our lives can be very helpful.
Mhm.
So for me, the tech now has offered all sorts of possibilities for doing that. It's not always easy, and I think the tech can help um, with note taking and things, but I get a little nervous about some of these tools that are available, the clinical record tools, because I'm not always
Okay.
sure how good the privacy is, and I think that's the issue. So social
Yeah.
workers, understanding what those tools are, but also understanding how to evaluate them and how to make sure that we're using something that's protecting our clients and ourselves.
Mhm.
Um, and that includes everything from texting to email and things like that. I think,
Mhm.
uh, and again, there are tools now that are a little more encrypted that you actually could use texting more easily. I used to use texting with my clients, even though it wasn't protected, but we
Mhm.
would talk about what are the problems, what should you keep, what's appropriate for text, what's not. I'm wanting
Right.
to kill myself is not the text message, you know,
Yeah.
boundary setting, those sorts of things. But I do
Yeah.
think that integrating tech in all of those ways, and I think generative AI, or what we know, talking about ChatGPT, some of those tools can be very helpful in coming up with some creative tools. I was somebody who had to learn how to use storytelling a lot in
Mhm.
treatment with people,
Mhm.
and AI can help you develop stories, right? If
Mhm.
that's not your superpower, which it really wasn't for me.
Mhm.
But again, we do have to understand the technology, understand what it's doing and what its limits are, and how to evaluate it, because that sort of critical thinking piece is really important, and digital literacy. I think for social workers, even young social workers who are very facile with all the technologies that are out right now, are not going to be facile with thinking about it from a social work role.
Mhm.
And so years ago, we made a video on social workers' guide to social media, which sort of looked at um, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, sort of. It was a
Oh, nice.
video. I was a dean coming out with my lightsaber, so I was mixing my metaphors, but it was really thinking about, how we use these tools
Mhm.
professionally. So, and they're different than how you use them personally. And
Mhm.
those are that sort of digital literacy, thinking about the role and the boundaries and the values, and then how do I use tech within that context? Very different than how I'm using it personally. And even just announcing on in those days I was using Twitter. Oh, great, my clients didn't show up, I have some free time. Well, what if one of my clients saw that?
Oh,
Okay,
wow.
right? Or
Yeah.
what would someone else who's a client of a psychotherapist who sees that say? Oh, I wonder if my therapist thinks that about me. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Absolutely.
Yes. So really having those sorts of thoughts about how am I representing um, therapist to others, in that context, and what are the fears people might have around that. Those are not simple or easy questions to explore. So I do think that it's to the point now where I think even if you're a social worker who doesn't like technology, we're living in a world where it is there, and we've
You have to
passed the
use
point.
it.
Yes, yeah, and you got to understand it. So anyway, I'm sorry, that's a long answer to your question. So
It's a good answer, and you answered a lot of the questions that I had, so that's good. But one of the things that you did mention are ways that people can get themselves into trouble with technology. And I have seen things on TikTok that really kind of worry me. I'm like, what, should you be saying that about clients? Because that's probably not a good idea. But what are some ways that you see maybe the clients getting in trouble with tech, and then
no,
social workers getting in trouble with tech?
okay. Well, yeah, clients can get into tons of trouble with tech. I mean, let's at a very simple level, you're in a relationship with somebody and you're sharing email and passwords and all of these other things, okay?
Hmm.
And that may sound really fine when you're in a part of the relationship where everything feels peachy, right? Um,
Right.
so it's kind of a boundary thing, right? It
Yeah.
tells you a little bit about the boundaries in the relationship. So the question of what do I keep separate? Where's my space? Where's their space? And people who are just sharing so much that they don't have separate spaces for themselves, I think is often symbolic of what's going on in the relationship in general. So I think the decisions you're making about how to share it with people in your lives, and those things can create trouble for you, because it also can, if things start to get rocky, your ability to protect yourself and separate yourself then becomes really, really
Sure.
problematic. I think, clients and people can get into trouble, um, too much comparing of themselves to others. I mean, social media can be very helpful, but I think it also can be very hurtful in the sense that people are they're putting stuff out there for an image and then
Mhm.
starting to judge myself by those and figure my
Mhm.
life's, it's what is the old in the 50s is comparing yourself to keep up with the Joneses was the phrase. And I think
Yeah.
it's still there. It's just can be very destructive to how you feel about yourself, in terms of your appearance, your weight, how you're assessing. Um, and I think it can actually make you feel worse. So I do think people have to start to learn to assess how is something help making me feel when I interact.
Mhm.
And it's not just true for tech, it's true for everything, but tech can
For
really
sure.
dominate in those ways. And then revealing things that you don't want the world to hear. I mean, when talking to, folks about this is if you're putting it out in a public post to everybody to see, it's a megaphone to the universe, right? And
Mhm.
is it
Mhm.
something when you're applying for a job, people are looking up your name, and they're going to seeing things. So helping people again assess boundaries in those spaces and what's public and private, um, and how you decide also what's trust and how to assess trust. These are often for me, for clients, it's part of other issues in their life. It's just showing up in tech too, but it's not
Mhm.
understanding always the ways in which tech can really work against you,
Mhm.
in those spaces. Um, so those kinds of dialogues for sure. And then I do think for everybody setting boundaries around how we use tech in our lives, that's an issue for clients as well as for social workers. But because if we're on it too much, we're not getting enough other types of stimulation in our lives, and it's
Yeah.
exhausting. And so that sort of issue of balance, it's more like I don't like the balance, but work-life integration and and wellness and self-care, all
Mhm.
of those things, particularly related to sleep, I think is a big issue for folks. So
Mhm.
that would be another issue. For social workers, all of those are issues for social workers too. But I think for social workers, it's very much around they get into trouble with using tech, email, texting in ways, again, for stuff that's not protected.
Mhm.
And, you send an email to a client and um, if you don't have dialogues at the very beginning of treatment, and I think the beginning of talking about um, protected communications, how the two of you will use the tech together.
Mhm.
I think because you may be sending an email to someone, first off, it's not encrypted, and then it's also getting seen by other people in their lives.
Sure.
And so really just social workers not having those conversations. I do think it helps to have that stuff done before you actually start care with folks about how you're going to handle emails, how you're going to handle text messages. I think texting can be very helpful to clients, and I don't mean on a regular, like, okay, let's do that all for treatment. I guess that I'm not opposed to that, but I don't have experience with that. But I have used it with people. But again, it's more about sort of updates and where's the limits and the boundaries. And for a social worker, you can't be there all the time, right? You need to have some limits, and what happens with emergencies, and setting some limits for that. Tech also, I think social workers can get into trouble with how they're storing information, and who has access to it, how they're doing it in an agency. Agency procedures are not necessarily solid procedures either.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can't assume that. And um, and I think that again, understanding both the limits of privacy, but also availability, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
or is a really really important for folks. And Yeah, I would say those are probably the main things. I mean, I think the big issue for social workers with tech is not always understanding it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it is about tech literacy for social workers, and the kinds of questions and things to be aware of, and how to link to other people who know about this when you don't know, because we can't know everything anymore. Tech's reached a point, even people who are tech savvy don't know everything. There's too much to know. So it is about, how do you find out, how do you get information from other social workers about this? And I actually think one of the skills people need the most, though, is learning how to play with tech a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
just to explore
Mm-hmm.
and see what's possible, and safe ways to do that don't involve critical information, that just involve sort of getting a sense for what's possible and what's not. I know social workers who work with younger folks, like, kids, adolescents, who actually have a rule about tech in the therapy room, that
Mm-hmm.
you're welcome to bring it in, but then it's open for us to work with together.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you want to bring it in, and and you're getting text messages from your girlfriend, then that's part of what we work on together.
Yeah.
And I think gaming can be really terrific for clients as well.
Mm-hmm.
To actually learn things, but that's a pretty specific specialist thing. I know some folks who do a lot of that,
Mm-hmm.
and actually some who've held groups in World of Warcraft early in the morning
Mm-hmm.
for kids who were not getting to school, as a way of getting them up and out, and then on to the day. So I think being able to work creatively in those spaces, but again, understanding the limits, and how to, where to draw the boundaries to be consistent with social work values and ethics, and obviously our legal responsibilities too.
Mm-hmm. And then what are some ways that you see technology getting us into trouble societally? Or
Well,
do you feel that's an issue, or do you feel that it's
oh
more
yeah,
benign?
no, it's huge. It's a huge issue now, and I
Okay.
think it's getting worse.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of it now is the surveillance that goes on in technology, right? Sort of
Mm-hmm.
watching, everything we do is being tracked. If we're using tech, even when we think we're not being tracked, we're being tracked.
Yeah.
Um, and um, and so I think who has access to that data, how that data is being used, both for um, to sell things to us, but it also tells us huge things about who people are and what they're doing. And right
Mm-hmm.
now, my concerns are the government now getting, using those tools of surveillance, of access to our data, uh,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of um, controlling people, going after them,
Mm-hmm.
restricting them. Data privacy is, I think, going to be a critical issue in this century. I'm just not sure. Um, I think most people in the United States think that I'm not doing anything wrong, so I have nothing to worry about.
Yeah. Yeah. But
And
what should they possibly be worrying about?
well, I think the reality is that all of that information that, say, Amazon has on me, right? And
Mm-hmm.
whatever, Amazon collaborates with the government. Even just a little piece of that data can be used to paint a picture that's even not true about me. In other words, things taken out of context
Mm-hmm.
are incredibly um, can be used to make you out to be someone you're not.
Mm-hmm.
But then the
Mm-hmm.
other is, you don't think of this as very private stuff, but all of that stuff, all of your emails, them getting accessible to somebody and published.
Sure.
There's uh, really good examples of how that stuff's been used to manipulate people,
Hmm.
and to actually shame them publicly and to start sort of a gang mentality, in social media spaces. So I think all of that, um, and I think people are being charged with, you know, um, right now we have people being charged with they're now going against the government because they've published something to support Palestine,
Hmm.
and basically they're opposed to what's happening in Gaza, and
Hmm.
make some statements about that, and all of a sudden you're now considered to be anti-government. So those are things that I think people don't think about, but I think retweeting something or resharing something, you've now been publicly saying that you're going anti-government. I think those are going to be extreme examples.
Hmm.
Um, but people know everything about you just by tracking you through GPS. And the reality is,
Yeah. And that stuff it is actually been used like
yes,
and I
criminally,
know a lot of the companies don't wait for a warrant. They just give the information, like for example, tracking where your signal has been with your phone.
yes. Yeah.
And it seems really benign, but once it's out there, it's out there, and you don't know how that's going to be used, right? And then the other thing that I was thinking of as you were saying that was the DNA kits, and now that's become an issue because
Right. Now,
that's also a place where when people were not waiting for warrants, they were just turning over
right,
information to
right.
law enforcement. And then now that some of those companies are going out of business, there are big questions about who the data belongs to. Can you get it back? And nobody was thinking of those things when
No, and I'm one of those people that never did 23andMe because I
me
didn't
neither.
trust I didn't trust what was going to happen to it. And
Hmm.
I could see people getting refused to get coverage for insurance purposes because you've got certain markers
Yeah,
and all of those things. So, and
yeah.
also, people being profiled, if people are going after folks who are Jewish and they're looking at certain genetic profiles to
Yeah.
identify. So it is all of that. Those things I think are much more concerning. And I mean, I worry about insurance databases. Okay, I
Sure.
do.
Oh yeah.
What everybody says that's confidential and protected, but I don't believe it. And I believe that they share information in ways they probably shouldn't, because I don't
Mhm.
think these things are regulated enough. So it's
Yeah.
one of the reasons why, I'm fortunate enough to have the resources to be able to pay for when I go for therapy myself, and not, I
Mhm.
don't run it through insurance because I don't trust the health insurance system. And actually, I would have those conversations with people
Mhm.
in my office when deciding, do they want to do insurance coverage or do they want to do something that's more sliding fee scale? And I'll work
Mhm.
with them either. But I would show them, you need to see what's being shared with folks when I put
Mhm.
a report in, because
Yeah.
it's not just a diagnosis code anymore. It's the equivalent of our progress notes, and
Yeah.
things that, and so I think all those information systems. And then I think when the government's using our data to decide things, I mean, we have examples, say, from states where they were using data to decide who should get services and who shouldn't.
Mhm.
Um, and they're using data that's built on our data sets, which have biases built into them. So people who meet certain profiles getting, uh, refused because how the data works, and the data isn't working accurately. Like even just some of the AI therapy stuff that people have been talking about. Can chatbot be a therapist? But they're
Mhm.
just, they found that chatbots have the same biases of the culture because they've been trained on
Of
the
course.
culture, and all of a sudden they're not offering empathy and support to a black client who's going through experiencing racism. And that's not seen as something that's something someone needs empathy and support for, because that's not fitting a cultural norm
Mhm.
based on whiteness. So I think understanding that all these data are built on data sets. These are not things that are neutral. They're built on
Mhm.
assumptions. And so
Right.
I at one point worked with some of our engineering folks to put in some NSF grants on how do we decide if AI is trustworthy? What does that mean? And I think that you have to involve people who are being served, but the
Mhm.
process need to be part of the process from the
Yeah.
beginning in shaping what that AI is going to look like, what the decision making. articulating all of the assumptions that are built in to the decision making and deciding them as you're going, not just the folks who are technical, but doing it in combination with people who are thinking about the values and ethics and with the recipients, that you need to
Mhm.
have an inclusive process. And almost none of the AI that we have going right now meets those standards.
Right.
And at one point we had a code of ethics that was developed by the computer science folks we were with. What ethics should they be doing based on this learning? How should they build that into training people in computer science? But
Mhm.
that's not a norm at all. I mean, that was just something they were starting to do in our university, and our university is just starting a department now on AI and society
Mhm.
that's trying
Nice.
to, yeah, build some of those things in. But I think people think, oh, well, you just bring the tech in and use it, and not understanding there's all of these processes that have gone into developing it. And it's not that people deliberately put it in there most of the time. I'm not going to say never. It's just they didn't think about where they were getting
Yeah.
it, what were the limits of the data sets that they were getting, and why were they there, who collected them.
Mhm.
And so all of those things, to not have protections and to not have those biases articulated. And for me, at this point, you need to keep a human in the loop. You need to
Mhm.
keep a human in the decision-making process. So our school has just developed a set of guidelines for the use of AI, generative AI in particular, but AI in school. And that's one of the principles we have, is that, if you're using AI for decision making, you need to have humans in the loop to sort of check on things. Now, there may be some day down the road where that's not possible, where that's not something we need to do anymore. I
Mhm.
don't see it in the world that we're in right now,
Mhm.
but I do think that you need to be able to always, if to have machines making decisions and there's not a way to get out of that loop, is a
Right.
problem. And
Yeah.
and we had people who were being denied services. I think Illinois was one of the examples of that a while ago, who were being denied services for food stamps and social
Mhm.
services, and there was no way to appeal it. There was no way to get
Yeah.
out of that sort of tech universe. So I think that's not the society that we want to build together.
Mhm. Mhm. No, those are great observations. Yeah, none of that stuff happens in a vacuum. So, the expectation that what we're feeding those training sets are neutral is it's not realistic, right? So we definitely need people thinking about that, right? But this kind of segues into the next part. So let's start thinking about research, and let's think about including clinicians in research, which is very much what I'm thinking about a lot of the time. So clearly, on campus and academia, social workers in those settings are doing research all the time. People in clinical settings, not so much. And there's pretty good research that says that there are better outcomes if the clinicians and if even the people receiving the services are included in the research. So what are your thoughts on that, and how can we improve that process?
Um, yeah, I mean, I would say that most of the research doesn't meet those standards of having those folks involved. Or, and even just we go into place and say we want to do this study, we don't design the questions together. We don't, so actually, one of my hopes in the sort of current environment that we're in, where a lot of federal research is being cut and these big grants are being cut, um, it's an awful situation. So I don't want to justify it, but I think when the research model gets disrupted as much as it's getting disrupted, we have an opportunity now to maybe build some different models.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, if you're doing I guess it depends partly on the research questions, but certainly within social work, I think this research needs to be collaboratively designed. And
Mm-hmm.
by that, it's not something that's designed by the researchers alone. It's got to be done in combination with the folks providing services and then the folks receiving services. I mean, you want to
Mm-hmm.
get multiple viewpoints in that, which takes time. And I understand that takes time, it takes collaboration. And the problem also is that I've seen people in doing that collaborative work, sometimes something shifts in the agency and the whole thing falls apart and doesn't happen. But you
Mm-hmm.
just have to build that into the process and also build that into your understanding of what it takes to do the research.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have possibilities now with tech, if we had the right technology, to actually help clients and social workers be be collecting the data that's meaningful to what's going on in their lives
Mm-hmm.
and having a way to pull it together so that a study can use that together as we start to learn from it. I mean, imagine, real-time progress and real-time
Mm-hmm.
information. that actually can drive very different questions. And I know within the long COVID community, some folks are doing this. They've developed the Patient Research Collaborative out of New York City are
Oh,
all
nice.
folks who were affected by long COVID. And they're actually collaborating in doing research with folks. And they've got, some sort of biofeedback type devices that have been similar to a Fitbit, but a little bit more to gather
Mhm.
data and to give people the feedback they need to sort of inform their treatment. But it also means collectively you get a data set that's really sort of very powerful. I would love that model of research.
Mhm.
Um, and it doesn't always have to involve tech, but I think tech can do that.
You can
I
facilitate it. Yeah.
Yes, and it makes it easier, less labor intensive. But
Mhm.
the questions have to be ones that are useful to the folks who are actually on the front lines doing this and to the service recipients, people who are getting services. And I think a lot of times researchers are not talking to those folks until after I have the whole study identified. And so it's
Yeah.
really creating collaboratives in our communities. And it doesn't all have to be local because the tech actually allows you to have networks around sort of themes like long COVID or other population sort of things that you don't have enough people in your rural area, but maybe if you link to other folks who are doing that, you can actually collaborate across distance.
Mhm.
Again, assuming the protections, but I would like to see us have a more collaborative model. Now that means that, you have to have dialogues with folks. And one of
Mhm.
my past lives, I ran an addiction technology transfer center where we
Mhm.
were trying to develop research practice communities to actually inform what the research needs to be and needs to be bi-directional. And it's not one of these things where you have a research that's been done, sort of in laboratories and then just rolled out to the
It's
community
top
because
down. Yeah.
yeah, and in fact, we found that that was not the case. I mean, the
Mhm.
addiction people and IAAA actually went out and, had money to bring evidence-based research to practice. And they went and asked all the practitioners, what are the biggest problems facing you? And then they were going to match them up with the evidence-based practice. And what they found were that the list of things that were confronting people in practice didn't match the list of things that were researched.
Yeah.
And there were just one or two things. Motivational interviewing was one of the things that came out as, oh, we need more of this.
Yeah.
And they also wanted more work on working with people who are pregnant, and having addiction issues. But there was
Yeah.
a whole bunch of other stuff that wasn't applicable. And I remember myself as a clinician going
Yeah.
to hear about Project Match, which was a big study to match people to the right treatments
Mhm.
and the alcohol problems. And then it talked about how they made decisions. They ruled out anybody with a comorbid drug diagnosis. And I thought, well, you've just ruled out my
That's
whole population.
everybody.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's because it was this design, that was done without doing it in collaboration. So I
Yeah.
do think to me, that's what social work research needs to be, is doing
Mhm.
that. And that does mean working with clinicians to do that, to think about research and to think about how to apply and to understand it. Social workers need to understand enough about research to understand, to be able to hold their own in those spaces.
Mhm.
And know what they do know and to be able to do that. Do they need to be able to run the statistics? Maybe not, but they need to be able to interpret the statistics. I mean, in other
Yeah.
words, make a decision about, when I look at this study, how do I figure out if this is even something that will translate to my
Mhm.
population and what are the things we're going to need to do here? So I do think that those are things that we're capable of doing, and we could transform how we're doing research. And I'm not going to say that's going to be inexpensive, but I don't think that it has the same kind of cost built into it that our current models have. But part
Right.
of it is you have to collaborate it with people so that it can be worked into how everyday business happens, in a clinic. So it's a very different skill set, but it would be very cool if we could start to do more of that type of research together. And what that means is that when you have limited resources, let's put them into things that will actually serve folks in a collaboration way and not just answer a question so I can get a publication out of it.
Mhm. I love those answers. Those are great answers, to me. Not that there are any right answers, but how do you think that we can start to change that direction? Because from my viewpoint, the places where there are issues are convincing management, that this is something that clinicians should have the time and the energy to be involved in. And then honestly, even from academia, I think there's bias, that
Oh, huge bias in academia.
this is ours, don't touch it, and we don't want y'all involved in this.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a huge problem in both places. I think within academia, there's this gold standard of the clinical trial, right? Which
Hmm.
is, and I'm not going to say it's not useful in some situations, but it does, I think we need multiple models. And actually
Yeah.
some of them have been out there. I mean, when I was in doctoral program, we learned about Edwin Thomas's developmental research model, where you actually how you developed new interventions and how you did that based out of practice
Hmm.
and move that along. And I think that's been lost. I haven't seen anything about that in a long time.
Hmm. Okay.
And yet it's still out there. So I think um, academia needs to be, and social work research needs to be defining these models more substantively and challenging these very narrow definitions. And it's not to
Mhm.
say that they're never appropriate. The question
Mhm.
is what's appropriate under what conditions for what questions you're asking.
Right.
Um, I think in terms of management, it gets down to the questions. So what is it it's important to management? And if management is driving the agency just based on money, I think
Mhm.
there's going to be problems. But if and I do think that's part of my concerns about who's managing our agencies now and how do they
Right.
understand them. Social work has turned over a lot of that management to MBAs, who may be actually, I'm not going to make assumptions about who the people are, but they're not getting training in sort
Mhm.
of thinking about human service management. So I think
Right.
that needs to change. And actually, part of my work with the Network for Social Work Management is to develop more management expertise
Mhm.
in social workers so that we take some ownership over those spaces. But I would say, hearing from management, what are the things you're struggling with in running the agency? What are the problems that you're trying to solve? Uh, and They may not understand them always in clinical terms, but I think you can connect them back to what's happening
Sure.
with the client population and with the workers. Actually, retention is a huge problem in agencies, right? In
Yes.
terms of, and they're losing a ton of money for that. And I think you can help people see they're losing a ton of money. And part of why they're losing a ton of money is because they're not involving their workforce in
Yeah.
creatively shaping what's going on. And so
Mhm.
you want to start saying, what would happen if you started to get people involved in asking questions about what they're doing in ways that they have ownership? You're going to get better management. You're going to get a more creative clinic place. And now, is it going to earn as much money? Well, maybe not in the short run. In the long run, actually, you're going to create demand for your service that you can't market enough. In other
Mhm.
words, word of mouth starts to spread that this is the place where people can get care that actually based on their needs as opposed to
Mhm.
just whatever the model is we're developing.
Mhm.
But again, you need a researcher team with the clinicians and the agency who can dialogue and ask the right questions. So instead of me going and saying I want to do a study on X, I have some ideas of what I'm helpful about, but what is it they're interested in, and how can we shape those questions so it works for everybody? And you may need to build some resources into a study
Mhm.
that will then help the clinic, right? In other
Right.
words, if you're going to be using space, there's those issues and how you're going to do that. But
Mhm.
if you're going to use some technology, how are you going to pay for that? And you're going to work some of that in
Yeah.
to support the needs of the agency. So I think those are again, it gets back to that collaborative piece and listening. I often would talk to students about you need to manage up. As a social work skill, you have to learn how to manage the people over you.
Yeah.
And the way to do that is to understand who they are, what's
Mhm.
important, and how to phrase what I want to get done in terms that they will understand.
That they'll buy in. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but so you have to be culturally literate in that culture to
Mhm.
be able to frame what's coming up in a way that they're going to say, oh yeah, of course, that's a no-brainer. But it's
Mhm.
not a no-brainer if I just argue it from my clinician perspective, if I can't
Right.
hear what their interest is. And I think that applies to research too. And so
Mhm.
it's the
Mhm.
same set of skills.
Mhm. So I think those are most of the questions I had. Anything else that seems important? Any other ways that we can prepare ourselves and our social workers to be better prepared in this world, to be more functional in this world.
Well, yeah, I have a question for you actually
Oh, am I in the hot
about
seat?
this.
Okay.
Yeah, because one of the things I've wondered about, and I'm going to draw my own experience. When I was a master's student,
Hmm.
I ended up learning a little bit of coding, not a lot, but I learned how to work with back then it was DBase 3 and just some
Hmm.
database coding and some things, just enough to be dangerous, so that I'd probably drive our IT department crazy now. But I've talked to social workers. I've talked to the Maria Rodriguez. I know you have some programming experience, and what I'm not sure about is when you think about what does social workers need to do social workers need to know how to code? And I don't have strong opinions about that. And I in this environment, I really am not sure, because now um, I wonder if people need to understand what coding does to understand the sorts of decision making that coding does, because it
Hmm.
sounds so mysterious,
Yeah.
and really you can almost map it in a diagram to say this is how it's making decisions. But
Hmm.
do you think that that's a core social work skill? Because I know with
Hmm.
your background that you may have some interesting thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it should be for a lot of different reasons. And I'm going to try to organize my thoughts quickly to say this. I do. And when students ask me what should they do to prepare for like a doctoral program, I say learn how to code. That's the first thing that I tell them. I'm very much biased towards R because that's the first and pretty much the only thing that I learned. But the thing that I love about R was its flexibility and the way it applies to so many different situations and how it can adapt to situations. So first, if you don't have any awareness of R, or if other people don't have an awareness of
Yeah.
R programming, um, it is it's set up so that if you see a gap in what it can do, if there's something there's not a functionality that's already available, then once you get to a certain point, you should be able to do that yourself. So there's like this base language, and then there are these they're packages. They're called packages. I had to think for a minute because I haven't done any coding in a little while. And so they're called packages. And some of them just make it a lot easier to use. And one of the biggest sets of packages is the tidyverse, which makes it much easier to learn.
Oh.
And it gives you a much easier way in, and all of these packages work together, and they speak the same language, and they teach you how to get the data and clean the data and organize the data and then present it in such a way that people are going to understand it. And so that's a nice set of packages. Um, and then there are a lot that surround things like psychology and doing research. So if there are social workers who are doing research and they see some things that are missing, then by the time they get to a certain level of art, they should be able to design their own packages, and then people can use those as plugins. And that's kind of a service to the art community. You prepare your package and you put it out there, and all that's available for free. So,
Mhm.
or like I knit, and if I see something that is going to help me to write patterns, I could create a little package for that and stick that out there, right? So it's nice that you're able to add this functionality and provide that to the art community. So that is something that's very cool. Um, the reason I think it's useful is because it can help people to think about first things. I'm going to say social workers specifically. It can help social workers to think about how to work with data differently, how you're collecting it and why you're collecting it, because you're going to have to think of that if you're going to be the person doing the coding, and then how you're going to present it and what it's being used for. The ways that I see it being used are, for example, I used to work for the VA. And so being able to collect data for something like what are just people getting better in your clinic. So I worked in a specialty clinic for trauma for a long time, and we would track things like uh, scores for prolonged exposure and scores for CPT. Are they going up? Are they going down? How are people responding to those? Why? What makes a difference? You can just let that sit there, and you can never use it again, which often happens in a lot of places, which is unfortunate. Or you can actually use it to make your case with management for the types of services you need in your clinic.
Yeah.
If all of those scores are through the roof and people are getting better, then somebody should know that, because that should mean more funding, that should mean more training, that should mean that you are having more clinicians go out and get those skills, right? And so being able to interpret that, like you said, in a way that explains up to management that there's some benefit to this, then why shouldn't all social workers have those skills? Our friend Lori, who writes a lot about these types of things in organizations, talks about the fact that we have to be able to learn to use data in a way to make our arguments. So, for example, if people are being displaced in housing in a community by gentrification, how do we make that argument so that people will listen, and so that we can get better funding for that, and so that we can stop people from being pushed out of their neighborhoods. And so being able to have social workers on staff who could do that and understand that, I think that's a really big deal. Um, and so we were seeing, I think that what I was seeing when I left my organization was that there were people who were starting to get that, and we were losing them because they got to a certain point in their careers and they weren't able to move up and do that type of thing, and they were trapped in things that look very traditionally social worky, which are not bad things. But if you get to a certain point in your career, you don't want to just do case management. You want to be able to tell people how to do case management better. You don't want to
Right.
just do social work. You don't want to just do therapy. You want to be able to tell people how to do therapy better, right? And that involves managing data and being able to work with management to explain those things and expand on those things. And if you're not allowed to do that, you're going to leave, right?
Right. You're going to go find a way to do
You're
it
going to
some
find a
other
way to
way.
do it. And so there were some people who were finding ways to go into things like logistics and actually do those things, but
Huh.
it was very limited, right? And so I really think that us as social workers and the world around us need to understand that a lot of us have those skills, and that a lot of us need those skills so that we can actually have a voice in those things. Because as you were saying, um, explaining those things in a way that's going to make a difference to the client is huge. And so, for example, if someone is looking at follow-up rates on people who have been in inpatient psychiatry and they're not getting the help they need right after they are discharged from inpatient psychiatry, somebody who is a career management person is going to look at that very differently from somebody who is a career social worker who's worked in mental health. And that
Yeah.
voice of the person who is a career social worker in mental health really needs to be heard, because I honestly believe they're going to understand that problem better, and they're going to be able to get services for that person better. So I think that was probably rambling a little bit, but that's
No, no, that's very helpful because I don't know, I don't personally know R, but I didn't understand that it had that kind of flexibility built into it. It sounds,
yeah,
and it sounds like there's a lot of different ways social workers could apply that once
yes,
they had those skills. And then,
yeah. To
um,
be very, because I know I'm being really rude and cutting you off. It's the ADHD in me, but I think this answers it more concisely. There's a whole range of skills, from just being able to plug things into spreadsheets, all the way to being able to build dashboards so that management can understand what you're saying better, to being able to build models and run large sets of data. So there's a whole range of stuff that you can do when you learn how to work with that data based on where you are. And now I'll
mhm.
shut up so you can say what you're going to say.
No, no, I mean, that's a very helpful, and way to think about it. And I would say that, um, you've sort of convinced me. So
Well,
that,
good.
yeah. I do think, being able to work with data, whether it's at the individual client level or to aggregate it across your, working with folks and looking at it over time, is so important particularly when you're trying to advocate for money. And I mean, like, even for insurance. One of
Yes.
the reasons why I would use assessment inventories and report those is that I had better luck with insurance in terms of getting,
Yeah.
reimbursement back, or getting, care extended.
Hmm.
And I do think that it allows you to really track what's meaningful. Most agencies that people are working in are only looking at data that they have to report to their funders, which
Yeah.
is not that kind of data.
Hmm.
And I think, as opposed to asking it about decisions that really would make a difference in how what they choose to provide and how to provide it, and are they doing well. And yet all that data would be amazing to present to people who are going to be paying for care, just, getting
Right.
access to, some resources, whether it be with foundations or anything else. So I do think that, and that's not something MBAs are trained to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I read an article by Lori Goldheim again a couple of years ago, and it just tracked for me so well. And the point that she was making is that, at large organizations like the VA, there are people who are trying to do that. And so they're not going to miss out on things like funding because they have a bunch of people who could do that type of work and make their argument in a way that's very clear and use the data to do that. If you're a small agency and you are competing for the same type of funding, then you're going to miss out because you don't have anybody on your team who can do that. And it's never even occurred to you that you should prepare somebody on your team who's able to use those types of skills. And so I think that if that becomes just working in data in any kind of way, even if it's in spreadsheets, I think that should be a foundational skill for social workers because everything that we do now is data driven, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to do that.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I do think that that needs to be taught in our research courses, but I also think it needs to be then used in our practice courses, right?
Mm-hmm.
You
Yep.
know, and yeah, so
Yeah, I
that's
teach clinical case evaluation, and I'm very clear about my feelings about it. Like
yeah.
every now and then I get a convert. It's really nice. But then you also still hear students say, "Oh, well, I became a social worker so I wouldn't have to use technology." And I'm like, "Stop. You're hurting me. Please stop."
Actually, the clinical case evaluation course was my favorite course. It was in the systems I taught it, and it wasn't just clinical. It was also you would do program and practice evaluation. But to me, it was very important. But I also would pull all that stuff into those practice courses too, so that this people start to see
Yeah.
this is
What's the
how it
value of
works.
it?
Yeah, the
Mhm.
value exactly. And but then being able to do that to aggregate it and use it with R, and for decision making, that would be fabulous. And it
Yeah.
seems to me if you understood enough of that now, if you're able to do that, that there is an opportunity to use some of these AI tool sets to help, accelerate and sort of do that. But you still got to understand it enough to understand, be able to
What's the
what you're doing.
question and how to get the right answer to the question?
Right. And how to evaluate if you got the right response from AI. I mean, that's
Yeah.
the other.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, so I hope that was a helpful answer.
they're very helpful, very helpful. And as I said, you've convinced me, although probably I'm not your typical in the sense of every faculty member say, oh yeah, no, absolutely. Because these are arguments we've had in faculty, but what is it people need to learn and does everybody need to learn all of the key points of experimental design, but you don't teach sort of this stuff. I don't know. I mean, I think it's people need
I
to
think
learn
it's
how to
important.
consume that research and they need to understand the quantitative skills to ask their own questions and things. But
Yeah.
um, to pick apart a study and to decide there's no perfect studies ever out there. There's always studies that make choices and you have to figure out what's usable from it and what's not.
Hmm.
And I don't think we teach any of those things particularly well at this point in most schools. So
Yeah, and the type of arguments that you get when I do believe comparison is the thief of joy. But when you're in a work setting, it is important because people are comparing it. So if you look, for example, at psychology and social work, who are often competing for the same jobs in these large organizations, really similar training up to a certain point, but people don't even know that social workers have, this skill set because it's not expanded or we're not giving the opportunity to use it. People don't know what we're trying to do. And so I think the real argument that they're making isn't that we don't have the skill set, they don't want us to use it. Um, because that helps to keep a delineation between the professions. But we have those skills and we should be able to use them because we do look at things differently. Um, and I do think in some of these settings that in order for social workers to be competitive for those jobs, if they do want to move up, then they really have to know those things. And I do think that for social work as a profession, I think it's necessary for us to know those things and have those types of skills.
yeah, yeah, no, you've converted me. So,
I'm just listening to myself talk now, but I'm sure there are other things you would like to do with your Saturday. Is there anything else that you feel like you would like to close with? Anything, any wisdom you'd like to share with us about technology and research and social work?
I don't think so. I think we've touched on like the major pieces. I mean, we could go hours and hours and hours, but
Probably.
try to respect that listeners also don't want to spend their entire day listening. Right?
Right.
So
8 hours good enough, right?
yeah, exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
well, thank you for doing this for us. I really appreciate it.
Oh, happy to do it. Thanks for inviting me. And yeah, I'm glad that you're getting your podcast started again, restarted.
Thanks.
Bye.
That's it.